Now, the green recovery, build forward better. We're hearing so much about the need to recover the right way from COVID. But how much is just hot air? Joining me now are two of Europe's top journalists. From London, The Guardian's Fiona Harvey, and from Brussels, Kalina Orashikov from Neue Zürcher Zeitung. Great to see you there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's start by reflecting on COP26 in Glasgow. Fiona, can we still hope for more?
So the commitments that were made at COP26 were still not sufficient to halve greenhouse gases by 2030. But what countries also agreed was that we would return this year, 2022, with revised targets that should get us somewhere closer to the targets needed for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in line with scientific advice by 2030. So we really did achieve an awful lot at COP26. But of course, we haven't got to the end of the road yet. We haven't got everything in place to fulfill what scientists say is necessary.
We haven't got to the end of the road indeed, Fiona. I mean, it seems that it's too easy to kick ambition down into the future, right, Kalina?
I mean, commitments have been made to come back this year with more ambitious climate targets. However, already days after the COP26 finished in November, and in recent months, what has become clear is that major emitters, including the EU, have no intention of fully revising or especially, more importantly, strengthening their climate targets this year. And so just to come back to the question about commitments, yes, I think the fascinating thing that we'll have to watch closely this year is to see how, especially governments in the EU, will work on implementing policies that are supposed to turn these commitments, however watered down or soft they may be perceived by the climate community, into reality.
Well, I suppose companies can be held accountable by investors and governments by their voters. Do you think that there's enough accountability, and does it work, Fiona?
Not all companies can be held accountable. It depends on the regime in which the company is operating. I mean, if you look at some of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters in the world are national oil companies. So there's an awful lot of global greenhouse gas emissions which are not accountable in the least.
Indeed. And as journalists, what convinces you from what you hear from governments or companies?
It's becoming harder and harder to bullshit. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen and that greenwashing isn't happening and that greenwashing won't be happening. And as Fiona says, that doesn't also mean that every company is transparent or every action can be held accountable. However, I do believe, and that's coming back to your question, what makes commitments or what makes statements credible for me is that the more data and the more ability you have to actually check certain commitments for yourself and compare it with others, the more likely it is to make comparisons that actually are meaningful.
And did you watch the movie Don't Look Up? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it.
I hope that it has an impact because a lot of the scenes in it were ones that will be very familiar to people who've written or read about the climate crisis because, you know, the idea of scientists just not being heard, scientists telling us that we're in extreme difficulty, that we are facing catastrophe. And now, I mean, just to talk particularly about the UK now, what we're seeing is a great upsurge of people claiming things that are completely wrong in the midst of the energy price crisis. An awful lot of the media is claiming that the energy price crisis is related to renewable energy, that renewable energy has somehow pushed up energy prices. That's just not true, but you'll see that claim made a lot. An awful lot of the media in the UK is now attacking the net zero targets and questioning whether we need those net zero targets and complaining, that they're too expensive and all kinds of things. And a lot of the coverage is completely either mistaken and wrong-headed, is putting a very generous interpretation on it, or simply cynical, which is another interpretation. And that, I think, is very dangerous.
Kalina?
What I would argue and what I've noticed and observed over the last years, what is important is not to cover climate as if it was just a single issue somewhere, I don't know, covered under the science desks or other special interest desks. What I find very encouraging is to see that most political journalists are increasingly covering climate change. And I'm happy about that. I don't think as a climate journalist, you need to write about the climate stories. That's not positive in a way. It should be general interest journalists also writing about climate change because it is a general interest story and it affects everyone. And so in that sense, I think that's crucial to have climate being part of a story across the board.
If we imagine there was no political limits and no complex negotiations, what would be the single most important policy needed, do you think, to get us to a net zero world with healthy nature? Kalina?
One policy I would argue that would be crucial is to actually learn and teach skills that is necessary to survive and prosper in a net zero world. I think that's one thing. Everyone is always talking about transitioning to net zero and shifting to greener industries and renewable energy and electric cars. And then we kind of forget that it also depends on people making that happen for real. So I think that's a policy that I would focus on in terms of education, not only to understand the facts, but also to have the skills to make it happen.
Okay, a lot needs to be done. Kalina Roshikov and Fiona Harvey, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.